Hey people, it's just Siobhan here dropping in at the start of this episode to tell you about a new sponsor we have at Knowing Animals. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to announce that Sydney University Press have jumped on board and are wanting to support the Knowing Animals podcast. Now, I love the University of Sydney. That's where I got my PhD, and I support the University of Sydney's press in its entirety. But there's a particular part of that press that I'd like to make listeners of Knowing Animals aware of, and that's the Animal Public series. Now, the Animal Public series, as the name possibly suggests to you, is focused very much on animal studies. The series is edited by Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, who you will know as a past guest of the show, and also the wonderful Melissa Boyd. And they already have published a lot of really fantastic books that we have featured many of them on this program. For example, they published The Flight of Birds, which we've discussed with Joshua Loeb, and they've also published A Life for Animals, which was written by Christine Townend, a former guest. They also wrote Animal Welfare in Australia, Politics and Policy by Peter Chen, who's also been a guest. And that's just to mention a few. So what I suggest you do is a couple of things. One is jump online and check out the Animal Public series at the University of Sydney. If you're an animal studies scholar and you're wondering where to publish your next book, have a think about Animal Publics as a possible publication site. And if you're able to order copies of the books for your library or institution, that would be fantastic. That would make sure that everyone would have the opportunity to read about animals, and it would spread the good word. That's all for now. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal study scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm actually recording this episode of Knowing Animals at the 2019 ASA Decolonising Animals Conference, which is going along absolutely fantastically well. The next conference after that will be in Sydney in 2021. So you really need to get involved with ASA. They're a great organisation. They put on an absolutely fantastic conference. The best way to support ASA is to become a member and also follow them on Facebook, because then you can find out about all the stuff that's going on with ASA. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, let's get down to business. As I said, this week's episode is coming to you from the 2019 ASA Decolonising Animals Conference in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I'm really lucky to be joined by Susanne Karr. Susanne is a philosopher and an independent scholar. And today we're going to discuss Susanne's upcoming article, Mirror Reflections as Agents of Connectedness, which is going to appear in the yearbook of the Irish Philosophical Society, which is going to come out in November 2019. So welcome to the podcast, Susan.
Hello.
So can you start by telling us why you wrote this piece?
The piece for the Irish Philosophical Society was initiated by the conference, of course, which was called Humans and Other Animals. And as a philosopher in human-animal studies, I am always interested in reflecting the nature of the relationship in a less scientific language as well. So to reach out to more people and audience which is not firm in philosophy, maybe, or sociology. So as there is lots of academic work and scriptures produced, it sometimes feels like preaching to the converted. And the mix of disciplines at the conference and the invitation to be a part of it was very interesting for me to reach out for that larger audience, and was also a welcome change of academic restrictions. So the main topic of my talk and my paper there was the status of the animal in the current society, being reflected in an image that I like to use, which is the mirror. And from this, I proceeded, as the conference was taking place in the beginning of November, which is Halloween. I recurred to a very prominent figure, the vampire, who has no mirror reflection. And from this I started talking about a mirror and reflections and relations and the lack of a mirror image as being the lack of a soul. And I took the vampire as a way of describing Homo sapiens in the current society, taking life and taking energy from other sources and not caring about them, just killing, and therefore being an image of lacking soul. And from there I tried to go on with the image of mirror, which also is used in neuroscience. We all heard about the mirror, the particles that reflect other actions, other people's actions, and also other animals' actions. And by this we can feel or observe what they are going through, more or less. So that's we can participate in their lives. It's more like inducing empathy when we observe what they're doing, and that's what is triggered by the mirror neurons. So from this, I enlarged the image of mirror, and then I went on in suggesting maybe possible ways to get the soul back into this mirror reflection, which is taking place already in this empathic movement, which is described in mirror neurons.
Wonderful. So your paper, as you say, uses the vampire as, I guess, a metaphor or as an analogy, perhaps we could say. And you're very concerned with interspecies relationships. Why are interspecies relationships important to you?
One of my main ideas, which I try to elaborate on also in my book, which is called Connectedness, is the idea of connectedness and interconnectedness between all living beings and the universe. So this is a kind of eco-feminist point of view that I'm taking. And I think it's clear that we can only survive when we relate to each other and we accept that everybody is codependent from each other, and see that not only as a forceful way of life, but as a joyful way of life, and taking surprise in other lives, or being fascinated by others, and paying respect, and just enjoying life together in an atmosphere which is flourishing.
But perhaps a little bit more than that. You are also interested in the concept of untamed or the wild self, and you argue that there's something about relationships between human and non-human animals that relates to the wild or untamed self. Can you tell us something about that idea?
Yes, I think the Western civilization is trying to force everything into taxonomies, excluding everything which is not scientifically explainable at the first sight, and maybe not in hindsight as well, and therefore cutting out everything which is which you could call wild, or cutting out the intuitive side or the sensitiveness, which is such a huge part of human, animal, and every life, And so I think bringing back the wild self is a very important action to regain this liveliness and this optimistic view of living together and also accepting the wildness of others.
And so are you concerned about kind of the scientific approach, or are you concerned about its dominance? What do you think about the scientific method?
Yeah, that's a very hard question to answer because, of course, I use scientific methods as well. But I think we have to work also on the idea of science, which is mainly derived from Cartesian ideas that excludes and desiccate and analyze and kill. And I think we should also refer to the idea of situated knowledge more, subjectivity, including the knowledge that we can only perceive what we can perceive as a person or as a being or as a species as well, which makes it necessary to widen the idea of science, so to a more including attitude probably.
And so one of the other themes of your paper has to do with the role animals play in cultural representation. Can you tell listeners something about how you perceive the role of animals in cultural representation?
I think that's very diverse, and if you look at a movie like Whale Rider, it's certainly something different than when you look at some pet movies with animals who try to return home, like some Hollywood movies suggest. I think that many people just try to soothe themselves, and in watching movies like this, that they're already very nice to animals and they don't have to consider anything more. That's why probably sometimes more critical movies are less well appraised.
So overall, what message would you like to convey to people who read your article? What are the main things you'd like them to get out of the article?
I think it would be very nice to just try to get over that artificial boundaries and to relate to empathy more and to rely on empathy more and not to get talked out of this feelings that you get when you watch somebody treating an animal badly or something like this. So in my article, I'm pointing to this image of the mirror, and I think the mirror neuron is a very good images for this. So it's even for people who are very skeptical, they could relate to this because it's a scientific notion.
Wonderful. Well, Susanne, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I'm not sure, but I think it would be Peter Singer's Animal Liberation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And also the work of Jane Goodall. Yeah.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
As a long-time vegetarian and later vegan, I probably always wrote in favor of animals. But the first piece would be my dissertation in philosophy and cultural studies, and it was about the human-animal relations.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, it's not very easy to name only one, but certainly one of the most important ones would be Carol Adams and also Vincent Desprez, the Belgian philosopher.
Oh, fantastic. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think the most important thing is to get out of the academia and talk to people more or transfer the knowledge in every way to people who are in the position of decision making, like in economy or politics. Yeah, and reach out.
Reach out. Wonderful. Like we're doing here. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Yeah, that would be similar to what I said before. I could help to tear down the artificial boundary between species to let entangled empathy win. That would be a very nice idea. That's what I'm working on.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've been heavily influenced by Laurie Gruen's work, is that right?
As well, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm very fascinated by her work as well.
Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
I'm trying to get away a little bit from the academic writing because of the reasons I mentioned before, to reach out more to a public which is not necessarily engaged in scientific reading. So to get more into fiction and presenting animals' positions in works of fiction, but I'm not really very far in this whole...
You're not far advanced.
No,
yeah.
not yet, no.
So where can people find out more about your work?
I have a website, and it's www.Susanne Karr, which is spelled SUSAKARR.com. And I'm announcing there when I have a talk or if I publish something on animal studies.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me on Twitter at SO_S. We're also on Facebook at Knowing Animals. I'm on Facebook at Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan. And also, finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.